today. We're today here to look at Bill C-15. It's coming again, as we have seen, in waves, a response to the pandemic, and we can look at it and say, right, first the government looked at people who didn't qualify for EI. What do we do when and the Canada Emergency benefit, the CERB, came in first, and then we had to make sure that that amount of money was improved, looking at things like reducing student loans. Bill C-13 in this place had 19 different parts and was dealing with what were the impacts on individual Canadians. There was not enough there for small business. We've been pushing harder on that. Bill C-14 gave us more, looking at programs to help small business with access to loans, to cover their rent. New announcements are made almost daily, and we still have people falling between the cracks. We still have small business falling between the cracks. But some of the people falling between the cracks who are helped today are our students. And it's terribly important to recognize that for many students, they didn't earn $5,000 last year, so they don't qualify for the CERB. They have some other reasons that they certainly can't expect to find jobs this summer in their chosen field. And the Canada Summer Jobs Program can't absorb the number of people who need the income supports right now and who need enough money to live on. Many students are, as we've heard today, people living as a married couple with children or a single mom with children also going to school. Currently, the benefit provided in this piece of legislation isn't adequate to help all of those people with their bills, because the amount of money in the initial offering is $1,250. But I do note that under this legislation, the minister may make changes by regulation to improve that. That, of course, is the Minister of Employment and Social Development. This piece of legislation requires that for changes to the amount received or changes for the number of weeks it's available, that minister must receive approval from the Minister of Finance. Personally, I would have gone in the other direction with this legislation. The Conservatives have made it more restrictive. I would have made sure the Minister for Employment and Social Development could make those changes without permission from the Minister of Finance, because they make so much sense. I do want to pause because I note that the Minister for Employment and Social Development is here with us today all day, and I want to thank her for her hard work. I know she's been, as many ministers have, been working round the clock. I know she's a mom with kids at home, and like all of my friends with kids still at home, keeping the kids occupied while also being on a computer day and night and on phone to make some of the most massive changes in that portfolio and certainly living memory is daunting, and I want to thank her for her diligence. The piece that's missing in this that I'm still concerns Greens greatly is, what are we doing for international students? So this piece of legislation applies to a person who is a Canadian citizen. It certainly applies to Indigenous Canadians. It applies to a permanent resident, as found under the definitions in the Immigration and Refugee Protection Act, or protected person within the meaning of that act as well. So what do we do about our international students? Now, we have something in the order of 500,000 potentially in this country now, international students. The International Students Program contributes over $20 billion to our economy and leads to the employment of 170,000 Canadians. As we all know, international students pay far higher fees. They come into Canada. They have to, of course, to contribute to our economy by paying their rent and buying their groceries. I don't know how many of you saw, it was on CBC a few nights back, a young woman being interviewed about her experience as a foreign student in Canada, and that her landlady was telling her, don't worry, you can't pay the rent, I won't charge you the rent, and her landlady was giving her groceries. That's really a wonderful Canadian moment. It brought tears to my eyes to see this young student saying if it wasn't for her landlady, she wouldn't have a roof over her head and she wouldn't have food. But what about the international students who don't have a landlady like that? So far, here are their options. If they made $5,000 last year, they can qualify for the CERB. But if they didn't, they can't. If they are an international student and also a permanent resident, they qualify under today's bill for the emergency benefit for students. But if they're not a permanent resident, if they only have their student visa to be in Canada, they don't. So we still have a problem. It's been identified by the Canadian Federation of Students asking for an improvement to this. They have two asks. One is that it's $2,000 a month, which is something the minister can do by regulation after this. But we'd have to come back here and re-legislate this to change the definition of student in order to allow it to apply to an international student, unless we tinker with one of the other programs, such as the Canada Summer Jobs Program. So there's still a deep concern for people who are falling between the cracks. The simplest way to avoid falling between the cracks, I go back to my earlier reference to guaranteed livable income. That would be one way of making sure there was no one in the situation in Canada right now who was so economically insecure that they were pushed out of the place where they're living or couldn't afford to buy food, can't find a job, and don't fit in any one of the existing programs. Now, I have to say, really in gratitude to the effort of everybody in Cabinet who's been working so hard, and all the civil servants who clearly have been working, because we're on the phone with them as members of Parliament on Saturdays and Sundays. If Canadians don't know, everybody that I can find within any government department is working 7 days a week, really long days. I've worked with them on rescuing Canadians stranded in other countries. It's extraordinary. The Parliamentary Secretary for the Minister of Global Affairs Canada and the whole team at Global Affairs Canada seem to have converted themselves into what I've been doing at home myself, a part-time travel agent. But to rescue over 20,000 Canadians from over 144 countries is a monumental feat. But I see the same level of hard work happening when we have Sunday phone calls and my questions are being answered by officials in the Department of Finance or Correctional Services or Indigenous Services. It's not to say that by thanking everyone involved, I'm saying everything's perfect. But for Canadians watching or listening to this now, you need to know that thousands of people are working in ways that I've never seen a government work ever in my life. And it's important to say to them, as we say to our frontline healthcare workers, to the people in our neighborhoods who are still stocking the grocery store shelves, who are driving the trucks, who are planting their fields now so we will have food in this country, to everybody who's doing the work while most of us are locked up at home, we're deeply grateful. And to all those civil servants who've been, and I know, knocking yourself out. I had a story from a friend. They had a family Zoom call, and the husband of one of the people on the family Zoom call mentioned that his wife was working in the Federal Civil Service, and he started to say, "my wife," and he just broke down and started crying. There's a level of strain on families working in the Federal Civil Service, and I just want to pause to say thank you to everyone who's working so hard. So when I mention the gaps, it's not to say this isn't good enough and I'm angry with you. It's to say we've got to keep working. And maybe in hindsight we can agree it would have been better to bring in one measure as we've been advocating. But I'm not angry you failed to do that so far in the Government of Canada. What we need to do is help each other as much as possible, and I think that means being kind. Being kind towards those we see are falling short of what needs to be done, recognizing that nobody's ever worked this hard ever, and that if we hold together as a country and keep our partisanship to a bare minimum, well, actually I'd like to see it erased into a nothingness that says we're all in this together. There's plenty of time when it's over to try to get a gotcha point in there, to try to score something for television. But right now what we need to do is be deeply grateful that we're in this country. We could be anywhere around the world, and trying to rescue people and knowing what's going on in places like Ecuador and India, knowing what might happen in the continent of Africa, knowing how hard people are working, and knowing how relatively safe we all are. We should be every single morning, and I know every single person in this place recognizes how very fortunate we are as a country and as a people. So I also ask us to think in this moment about whether we can't do more for the developing world, can't do more to avert famine, can't see ourselves stretching ourselves a bit more. But for now, I'll be voting for this legislation, but with a very strong plea that we do more for our international students, that we figure a program out where it's needed so that no student falls between the cracks. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments. Questions et commentaires. The Honourable Member for Stevenson, Richmond East.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I would like to thank the member from Saanich Gulf Island for her passionate advocacy for international students. In the House here, I don't know how many members would fit in that category, but I myself actually was a foreign student a couple of decades ago, and that's what we were called back then. We, like hers, like she said, we appreciated what this country, Canada, has provided us. But we realize that we are foreigners in this country, and we appreciate the generosity of allowing us, a foreigner, coming to this land to get educated, to receive the services that equal to all other Canadians. And we appreciated that. And we also appreciate the opportunity given to us that we have to be a self-reliant individuals in this country. And that's why when we apply for a student visa coming to Canada, we are to prove that we have ability to support ourselves in these countries. And we are proud of the self-reliance, the ability to rely on ourselves and not to be a burden on Canadians or Canadian society. And that's why I think we as parliamentarians in this House here, we're not just responsible for doling out compassion, but we are also accountable for the financial implication. If the compassion that we're doling out, it's not without any cost. It's either borrowing from the future, burden to our next generation, higher taxes, or either cutting from some services. There are only three ways how this would actually fit. And that's why I think, while I appreciate the member from Saanich Gulf Island advocating for international students, I personally do not believe it's a responsible way, and it's not something that would actually get much support from the international student. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Saanich Gulf Islands.
Thank the Honourable Member for Stevenson, Richmond East. Is a perfect example of what we always hope when we have these wonderful international students coming to Canada. They've sometimes been dubbed ideal future Canadians. I've had so many international students in my own riding who've stayed and contributed to society, become Canadians. And it is true, they have to show they can support themselves, but there's never been a box you had to tick that said, I can support myself in a pandemic when there are no jobs and I have to stay home. So the situation is extraordinary, and on that basis, I think our response should be extraordinary.
Questions and comments.